Welcome, everyone. It's about 1 minute to the hour, so we'll be starting the weekly briefing soon. Welcome, everyone. It's about noon, and I see that there are several lines still dialing in and logging in, so we'll just wait another 60 seconds before beginning. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you to FortneyScott's first COVID-19 weekly briefing. These briefings will be held every Monday and will cover the latest topics and developments with regard to COVID-19. This briefing will also be recorded. If you have registered for this briefing, then you have automatically been added to the list of registrants for all future weekly briefings. These will continue as long as circumstances develop. So this week's presenters include David Fortney, who's our co-founder of FortneyScott, Leslie Silverman, one of our shareholders, and John Clifford, one of our associates. Just a couple of preliminary items. If you have a question, you can feel free to send your question in the GoToMeeting box. The presenters will be provided with your question, and we will try to get to all of the questions during the briefing. If you need more information or assistance in these matters, please feel free to send an email to info@FortneyScott.com. And with that, I'll hand this over to David Fortney.
Great. Thank you so much, and greetings, everyone. In addition, as indicated, joining me is Leslie Silverman. Leslie, do you want to say hello so they have your voice?
Sure. I think they're going to be able to recognize my voice. But good morning, everyone.
I hope so. And also John Clifford. Would you like to say hello, please?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon.
Great. So we're really, all of us, pleased to be with you, and we are, as I'm sure all of you are, presenting to you from our respective homes. We are all sheltering in place at the FortneyScott team. We have been working virtually now this is our third week, and I'd like to say we're getting used to it. I think we're getting used to it. We're probably getting better at it, but I'm not sure we're perfect. But anyhow, it is part of the challenge and part of what we want to do, because we have responding to clients and the very rapidly changing developments, is see if we can assist in parsing through these rapid fire legislative as well as regulatory and other government agency changes. It has really come at an almost overwhelming pace in the last several weeks. And so what we're going to do is begin, as indicated, a regular briefing every Monday, and we'll do it at 12 o'clock noon Eastern. We'll run it for about an hour and try to just scrape through all the noise out there, try to distill it down to the key points. We're going to focus on what employers need to know and do our level best to assist all of you in staying on top of and able to successfully manage and navigate these changes. As indicated, if you have questions, please put them in the question box. I think everyone's familiar with how to do that, and we will do our level best to try to get to all of them that we can. Well, let's do this. Let's go through some of the slides. We have a few housekeeping points. First, go to the next slide. Just a mention about our law firm. As many of you know, we are a Washington, D.C. based. We're actually a woman-owned law firm, and we do focus very much on the federal agencies regulating the workplace. Many of us have had extensive experience with those agencies, and of course, they are directly the ones that are in the crosshairs and leading the effort to implement the new laws and develop and codify the new regulations that all of us are starting to grapple with. Next slide, please. Of course, what we're doing today is providing general information, and although the three panelists today are all lawyers, this is not intended to provide legal advice. Each of you joining today is encouraged to secure advice from your respective either corporate counsel or outside counsel, and to ensure that your particular facts are accurately assessed under the law. So let's talk briefly now about the agenda. Like I said, we're going to spend about 60 minutes together. And what we want to do is first start with an overview of the new laws. There's been a lot of rapid fire changes. And so we want to at least cover a little bit about what I call how the sausage was made. And then we're going to look a little bit at one of the most significant provisions, which is the addition of both new paid sick leave as well as paid family leave that goes into effect later this week on Wednesday, April 1st. As indicated, we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for questions, but if you do have questions, put them in the chat box, and we will try to pick those up as we move along. So, well, let's start with, the foundation and how we got to where we are. And Leslie, among Leslie's experience and expertise, in addition to serving formerly as the vice chair at the EEOC, Leslie also has served as legislative counsel for the Senate Labor Committee and has more than a passing familiarity with how things actually happen on the Hill. So I've asked Leslie if you could sort of kind of help us scope out what we've got, because these news reports, I think many are finding very confusing. We've got a lot of bills, a lot of names, a lot of nomenclature. Can you help us initially? Let's get those foundational elements down.
Thanks, David, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'd say what's been going on in the Hill, just like everywhere else in the country, is hardly business as usual. Certainly different than my experience way back when. Congress passed and the president signed 3 very large major pieces of legislation in the span of 4 weeks. Actually, less than that if you start from the beginning to the end. The first bill, the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act, was enacted on March 6th. This was an $8.3 billion package to help fund our country's response, and it included things like emergency telehealth and waivers and vaccine development and some support for state and local governments. This was not labor and employment legislation. It was more appropriations, and we won't focus it on today, but you may hear news reports refer to these bills, this legislation, as phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So we wanted to mention that was phase 1. And today we are going to focus on provisions within phase 2 and phase 3. Phase 2 was originated and passed by the House, and then it was revised and it was passed by the Senate and signed by the president all on the same day, and that was March 18th. The bill, which is called the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, sometimes shortened to Families First or FFCRA, you might have seen it called. It contains a number of provisions that apply to business and to employment. And most importantly for our discussion today, it contains some provision providing for paid leave to smaller employers, which that bill defines as less than 500 employees. It also contains some unemployment insurance provisions, $1 billion of funds for state unemployment programs, It allows states to have more flexibility to provide unemployment insurance, including eliminating the need of employees to wait a week before they're eligible for UI, and easing work search requirements, things like that. This next slide. Next slide. So following that, we had the third phase. The president signed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, which has the CARES Act, a nice acronym, similar to what, when the bills always try to have acronyms, but now they have a little bit more time. Now, this bill originated in the Senate. It was drafted originally primarily by the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and then it was negotiated with Schumer. And my understanding is that Nancy Pelosi was weighing in with Schumer's folks. Altogether, it's nearly 900 pages. It's a $2 trillion relief package. It clarified and modified some of the provisions in phase 2, addressing paid leave, which we're going to discuss today, and also the UI. Most notably, it made unemployment insurance available to self-employed people, such as freelancers and gig workers and contractors, by creating a temporary pandemic unemployment assistance program. It also contains emergency grants and forgivable loan programs for smaller employers, some of which are going to be administered through the Small Business Administration. Of course, it provides direct cash payments for individuals earning less than $99,000 a year and couples making less than $198,000 a year. So that is a very quick overview of the legislation. But David, I know you're going to talk a little bit more about CARES Act strings. Next slide. David?
Thank you. Sorry, was on mute. So with respect to the three phases, the two bills, Family First and CARES Act, what directly affect workplace issues that we are focused on for compliance. In addition to some of the better publicized changes directly affecting payments to employees and underwriting that we're going to discuss here today, there are some other things that we thought were worth noting. And these are our words. The legislation doesn't refer to it as strings, but showing that if there are certain obligations, new legal obligations for what are referred to as mid-sized employers. And again, Leslie indicated that folks less than 500 employees are viewed as small employers. Mid-sized, we're talking 500 to 10,000 employees. For those mid-sized employers that seek some of the loan money that's under highly favorable terms in the CARES Act, there are a number of somewhat surprising strings that we wanted to be sure. These are sort of what I'd call almost traps for the unwary. You need to be aware of. In seeking the money, the process will include that the employer will have to engage in neutrality in union elections, and that it isn't just that you'll actively be neutral, but that you will have to certify that you are remaining neutral. What neutral means, again, isn't completely clear. Does it mean that you can't conduct any responsive campaign, any response? Does it mean that you have a toned-down response? Not known at this point. But what is known is that the statute does impose the condition: if you take the loan under this program, you must agree that you will remain neutral in forthcoming union elections. Additionally, there is a workforce preservation requirement. That is that if you take a loan, that you cannot chop the workforce. You cannot have a force reduction of greater than 10%. Or put it affirmatively, you have to retain at least 90% of the workforce at full compensation and benefits. So again, businesses that are looking at this need to really look in light of what orders, what the economic forecast is up through the balance of the federal fiscal year, which takes you through September 30th of this year, and be in a position that you will have to underwrite and retain 90% of your workforce. That is a challenge for some folks. And finally, there is an anti-job offshoring requirement. It occurs during the terms of repayment as well as for 2 years afterwards. So no offshoring of jobs if you take money under this program. So those are strings that aren't talked about. These are other kind of workplace conditions. You can appreciate that there are a number of interest groups that have taken advantage of this key legislation, knowing that it would be passed, and that some of the reforms that certain interest groups had been seeking made it into the legislation. So these are ones that, even though a lot of today we're going to be talking about employers for paid leave, that are smaller employers, we want to talk about this mid-size and make sure you're aware of these strings. Well, let me turn to the next slide that talks just briefly about paid leave, because this is where we want to spend most of our time today. And the Families First bill, or Phase 2 bill, as it's often referred to, has two key provisions that provides circumstances under which pay will be provided to employees who are unable to work for coronavirus-related reasons. And so within this massive Phase 2 or Families First bill are two pieces of legislation. One is known as the Emergency Family and Medical Leave Expansion Act, and conceptually that's exactly what this does. It takes FMLA that everyone is familiar with, that's been on the books, and now retools it for certain benefits and certain metrics that are used to determine who is eligible and what benefits are to be paid. We're going to drill down into that. But basically, it specifically drills down into the existing FMLA, and this is Title I of FMLA, and provides for up to 10 weeks of paid leave when a parent has to stay home to care for a child whose school or daycare is closed due to the coronavirus circumstances. And as we know, across the country, the vast majority of schools, in fact, are closed, and a significant portion of the American workforce is grappling with just that. Which parent or parents or child care provider is staying home, and how those duties and caring and helping homeschool are being balanced with work obligations. The other component, and I would give Congress credit, Leslie mentioned the rapid time frame. These are the two key most trying circumstances that I think most workers in the United States are facing today, is the people that themselves become ill, and whether they will receive paid leave, and what are the circumstances, and in what amounts will employees be paid. And so now we have a new paid leave, federal paid leave requirement that deals with when employees cannot work for the coronavirus-related reasons. So those are both very significant changes in the law, although they have sunset provisions tied to the coronavirus. We'll see if they in fact get extended, but that's how they were set up today. The environment that we're working in, we have the Labor Department that is the primary, and it's the Labor Department's Wage and Hour Division that is the primary enforcement agency that's tasked with implementing these new requirements. And the Labor Department is developing very robust guidance. The Wage and Hour Division is publishing questions and answers, and we're going to highlight some of those. They are coming fast and furious. As recently as late Saturday afternoon, this weekend, a new set, about 20 new questions and answers were published. Don't worry, we have sorted through those, and we'll give you some highlights in a couple moments here on what's included there. The Labor Department also, under the statute, is required to be issuing regulations, possibly later this week. We will see what those regulations look like. Additionally, I just mentioned that other Labor Department agencies, specifically OSHA, OSHA has issued very helpful guidance on the OSHA page, and a non-labor department agency that also has guidance. If I were just looking generally across the board, I would include EEOC. Those three agencies, Wage Hour Division, OSHA, EEOC, all have very good websites that they have loaded up quickly with a bunch of very useful materials, and it's organized in a very user-friendly compliance for those of us that are wanting to understand what the changes are and what we should be looking at with respect to workplace compliance. So let's go from that sort of, we've covered kind of the foundation. We know what's there. We know that we have this, in family friendlies, we have this new FEMLA paid leave, and we know that we have new paid sick leave. So what I'd like to do now is ask John if you can begin to, we're going to bore down into a little bit of the nitty-gritty so we understand who's covered and how these new requirements are actually going to operate. So John Clifford.
Sure. Thanks, David. As David mentioned, with these two leave laws, there's a lot to unpack here, and we thought that one of the sort of best ways to walk everyone through this today would be to compare these side by side with what employers are normally obligated to do under FEMLA, then under the expanded Family and Medical Leave Act, and as well as the Emergency Paid Sick Leave that both were part of the Families First Act. So we've divided these up into different sort of key topics regarding coverage and what the obligations are, and we're just going to walk through those and can hopefully offer some additional details as we go. And again, I know they mentioned if people have questions that they'd like for us to try to get to at the end, please, I believe you can utilize the chat function. So as we're going, obviously one of the key issues here to start with is who's covered by these new laws. And I believe most people are aware that with regular or before pre-amendment FEMLA here, it applied to employers with at least 50 employees. So that right off the bat is a key difference here, because the new leave laws, both the expanded FEMLA and the paid sick leave, are applying to employers with fewer than 500 employees. So those can apply to employers with even less than 50 employees. So the small employers are covered here. One thing that we want to touch on here is, although both for private employers, both of the new laws do apply to less than 500 employees, there are some differences when you get into public agencies or non-private entities, and those are laid out in the chart a little bit here. With regard to the expanded FEMLA, we did want to touch on the fact that the amendment to FEMLA was only to Title I of the Family and Medical Leave Act. As many people know, federal employees are generally covered under Title II of FEMLA. That has not been amended as of yet. So most federal employees as of today will not be covered by this expanded FEMLA leave that is provided. On the flip side of that coin is that they would be covered by the emergency paid leave. So just we wanted to note that as we go here. And with regard to counting these, who is covered, who's not, obviously it's a brief chart here just saying fewer than 500, but that in itself is a lot of details can go into that. So if we could turn to the next slide, we're going to just offer some additional details based on the guidance that DOL has provided thus far. So as you know, the initial matter for addressing these leave laws is, do you meet the number of employee requirements? Do you have fewer than 500 employees? And these laws are fairly expansive in terms of who is covered, and it includes employees on leave, temps, day laborers from a temp agency. It does not include independent contractors, and we've had some questions between those day laborers and the independent contractors. And just to touch on that, it's from what we've gathered from the guidance, the day laborers incorporate where you have an arrangement with a temp agency to bring in those on an as-needed basis, those day laborers, as opposed to contracting directly with independent contractors. Another thing to note here would be the fact that when you're counting these 500 employees, when is that snapshot date? Under FEMLA, pre-amendment, it would be looking at, do you have the requisite number of employees, in that case, equal to or greater than 50, for 20 work weeks in the either current or previous work year. That's not the case here. When you're looking at the new leave laws, the snapshot, the time at which you would look whether you meet the 500 employee or under 500 employee requirement is at the time leave is requested. So that could obviously lead to some situations for employers who are hovering right around there, where they could go from not covered to covered, depending on if they drop below that 500 mark. So that's something to keep track of, as depending on when the leave is requested, and is crucial to making that determination. Another thing to note here is that, and we've had a lot of questions about this already, is how possibly joint employers are addressed, or single employer determinations. The DOL has touched on this in their question and answer guidance. They've, as you can see on the chart, they've indicated that you would go by the FLSA joint employer test in those cases. And as you can see, and so if you had a common employer who, as the FLSA lays out, who you had control over, you could make determinations regarding pay, regarding termination of employment, things of those nature. They could be wrapped up into your employer account. Similarly, if you're considered integrated employers, two separate corporations who are integrated employers with sort of common control over employees, then again you could count those employees up under those tests. Now, this has an interesting facet to it, in that now employers are looking at, can they be considered joint employers? Can they pump up their employees to essentially get out of the coverage ranges here? And just a point of caution, as we've discussed with some employers already, is that if you are asserting that you would be covered under this for these laws, that you're at the same time asserting that you're covered, that you satisfy the test for joint employment under FLSA and FEMLA. So we just want people to keep that in mind as they're considering this and making these determinations about whether they are above or below that 500 employee benchmark.
Right. So this is kind of an interesting strategic point, because historically, most companies that have interrelated corporate entities go to great length to ensure that they are kept separate, that they're viewed as separate employers, that they're not combined. So in the event that there is liability, whether it's under the wage hour laws or otherwise, it is contained and limited to the direct employer, the entity at issue. This law does allow some level of roll-up, and there's a cross-tension here. Some companies are wanting to roll up so that they're not saddled with these new additional pay obligations and some of the other obligations we're going to discuss. But the cautionary note that we would raise is that once you concede that you are consolidated, particularly under the FLSA's wage and hour test, for purposes of this statute, these coronavirus-related requirements, likely you will be stuck with that to come down the road with respect to FLSA liability and potential other laws and obligations. So that's one. Our view is go cautiously and think comprehensively. Don't get caught just focused on one issue in sorting this issue out for your respective organization.
Roll over to the next slide here, a few more details on employer coverage. As I mentioned when we were looking at the chart, there are potential exemptions for small businesses, businesses with less than 50 employees. The laws laid out that the DOL has authority to exempt the smaller businesses, and the wording is when the imposition of such requirements would jeopardize the viability of the business as a going concern. The DOL has, in the question and answers, has actually added a little more detail to this as to what would be required. And as noted there, these are, if you have access to the DOL questions and answers, numbers 58 and 59 are address this specifically. And they provide some criteria for what you may have to show in order to be exempt under this test. One being that the financial obligations would exceed your business revenues and essentially cause the business to cease operating. Or yet another part of the criteria would be that it would granting leave to these employers or not gaining this exemption would place your business at substantial risk of the financial health of your business at substantial risk, and essentially that you may not be able to continue operations. And finally, another piece of the criteria is that there quite simply aren't enough workers who can do the job of the people that would be going out on leave. So the DOL has gone ahead and laid out a fairly straightforward test or specific test there for those smaller employers who are going to be essentially applying for that exemption.
John,
right. And then go ahead, Leslie.
Will that small business exemption apply to all types of leave or only certain types of leave?
Great. Thank you, Leslie. That's a good point. The small business exemption, it is available under the expanded FEMLA and for the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, but just as a note here, it is only available for one type of leave, that being people who are going on leave to care for a child whose school or daycare or provider is no longer open. So that is the only time that a small business can seek this exemption. If it's for an employee going out on sick leave for coronavirus-related reasons, they would have the same obligations, paid leave obligations, as larger employers in that case.
So this is one that we expect in the next week or so as regulations start coming online. If labor meets its scheduled publication date, we should be developing more detailed information and understanding of these issues. Okay.
We could scroll through
Talk a little bit about which employees are eligible. Right.
Yeah. So having covered which employers are covered, the next step is figuring out which employees are eligible. And this is an area where these laws have really expanded who is eligible to take these types of leave. Under traditional FEMLA, the employee would have had to work at least 1,250 hours during the preceding 12 months. That standard is no longer the case. In fact, with regard to the expanded FEMLA, employees who have been employed for now just 30 days or more are eligible to take this paid FEMLA leave. One note here is in Phase 3, the CARES Act that was implemented actually clarified who may qualify for this, and they expanded it to include people who had been laid off after March 1st, but who had worked at least 30 of the previous 60 days before that. We essentially view that as sort of filling a stopgap for employers who may have already laid off employees prior to this legislation going into effect, or who, even after it was passed, needed to lay people off prior to the April 1st effective date. So essentially they could, if people were laid off, they could now be brought back on with the knowledge that this paid leave would be available to them. And so that covers the expanded FEMLA, the 30-day or more requirement. The emergency paid sick leave is even more inclusive. In fact, any employee who is employed once these go into effect on or after April 1st would be eligible for the emergency paid sick leave, which provides 2 weeks of paid leave. So those, quite expansive there. And we did just want to touch on the fact that both of these new laws do have exclusions. Employers may exclude employees who are involved or who are healthcare providers or emergency responders. One note on that, and this is some of the more updated DOL guidance as they've revised their questions and answers. There had been some question as to who would qualify as a healthcare provider, who would be able to be excluded under this. And what the guidance has detailed is that these exclusions in themselves are actually quite expansive. It does not just apply to an actual, maybe a doctor or a nurse or someone directly providing healthcare, but anyone who is employed by either a hospital, a healthcare center, a clinic, any sort of greater provider of this healthcare. So any employee, whether you work in the accounting department, the administrative team, it doesn't matter if you're the one actually providing the health services, those employers would be able to exclude any of their employees who work at those types of businesses. So that's something to keep in mind here, is that is allows the employer a great deal of discretion in those situations.
John, go ahead, Leslie, then I'll go.
Sorry, David.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the current FMLA versus the expanded FMLA, the current FMLA has a worksite exclusion for coverage issues. Does that apply to the expanded FMLA?
Right, that does not, and so Leslie's referring to that to be an eligible employee under the FMLA, you have to work at a site where there's 50 employees within 75 miles is the test that's usually used. That would not apply to this expanded FMLA nor the emergency paid sick leave. So that is another test that would open this up, and really the determination here is if the employer is covered under the less than 500 employees nationwide, then the employee, given that they meet these requirements, in the case of expanded FMLA having been there for 30 days, then they would be eligible regardless of if there's another, however many employees are within 50-mile radius or any proximity to them, they would be eligible. So that's another point that has opened up this leave, making it available to vastly more people.
This is David. I have a question here. We can stay on this slide, but a moment ago, just a clarification when we were talking about the single employer determination, and this is where different corporate entities and whether they get rolled up and counted as a single employer. And the questioner raises whether it's the same test for both the paid sick leave, the new paid sick leave, as well as for the Expanded Family and Medical Leave Act. The answer is, at least according to DOL question and answer 2, question 2, that there are slight differences. That with respect to paid sick leave, the joint employer test that's used under the Fair Labor Standards Act, that I think most people are very familiar with, that is what will be used to assess whether two companies are or are not a joint employer with respect to paid sick leave. On the other hand, with respect to the expanded FMLA, for that purpose, the Labor Department is going to continue to follow the existing integrated employer test under FEMLA, and so they will just continue that. So those are tests that have sometimes, under particular facts, can have a different result, typically not, but it's possible they could. But just so we're very precise on that, because I had a questioner that asked about that. So FMLA expanded follows the FMLA integrated employer test. Paid sick follows the joint employer FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act test. Okay, thank you. That clears that question.
So we've covered the eligibility, which employees are eligible. If we want to move through to the next slide at this point.
Talk about what leave is actually required. Okay, John.
Right, so this is, yeah, exactly. What is actually required, assuming you are a covered employer and that an employee is eligible for leave. Under FMLA, traditionally, it's been 12 weeks of unpaid leave, rather straightforward there. The new laws, just at the outset, do provide paid leave is what they're the big obvious change here. So for the expanded FMLA, what it actually provides is, again, up to 12 weeks of leave under similar to FMLA. And while the first 10 days of that are unpaid, the remainder will be paid. And we'll touch below on the how you determine pay, but you'll be paid on a 2/3 rate of their regular pay. Now, as I mentioned there, and as you can see in the chart, again, the first 2 weeks of expanded FMLA are unpaid under that act. However, if you look over to the emergency paid sick leave column, you'll see that it actually fills in that gap there. It provides those 2 weeks of paid leave for a number of reasons, but that would fill the gap for expanded FMLA so that someone would receive essentially 12 weeks of paid leave if they have qualifying reasons. Just to touch on the weeks of paid leave, for full-time employees, it is rather straightforward. It's considered 80 hours of paid leave. When you are dealing with part-time employees, it's based on their average hours worked over a 2-week period for the emergency paid sick leave, and to calculate the final 10 weeks in the expanded FMLA as well. But to calculate that average hours worked, if someone has a normal recurring schedule, of course that could be used. But if in the case of varying schedules or variable schedules, the DOL has provided guidance on how to calculate that as well. And essentially, what's done is you first look back over the past 6 months of employment, and for the average daily hours or weekly hours in this case, and you would apply that. If a part-time employee hasn't been employed for 6 months, then you would look either at is there an agreement on how much they would normally work, or if there is no agreement, simply look back for as long as they have been employed to calculate that average number of hours worked. And that's how they would be paid out for initially the first 2 weeks of emergency paid sick leave, and thereafter for the remaining 10 weeks in the expanded FMLA. Now, one further note, just with regard to more likely the overtime employees here, they are entitled to 80 hours. I would note that if they're scheduled to work overtime for potentially 50 hours in the first week, they would be eligible for that. Of course, the flip side of that is that they would only be then eligible for 30 hours in the second week. It's a total of 80 hours, but it would be those first 80 hours that they would be scheduled to work. So there is a potential for paying overtime as part of this paid leave.
Well, counting overtime hours, but the pay's at straight time. Okay. So let's talk a little bit. Now we really bore down into the weeds and start to get into the reasons for the leave.
Right. This is there's a lot.
Don't be overwhelmed by the slide, but this
is we included so much because we really feel that the wording of these qualifying reasons for leave is important to cover here. And as we're going through it, just as a starting point under FMLA, there's the traditional reasons for FMLA, whether it's the birth or adoption of a child, caring for a family member, or the employee caring for themselves or dealing with a serious health condition. So where this has been expanded, and with regard to the expanded FMLA, it's been expanded to include only one additional reason to traditional FMLA, and that is an employee that's unable to work or telework because they need to care for their child whose either daycare or school is closed or their child care provider is no longer available due to COVID-19 reasons. As David mentioned, this is taking place across the country with school closures and daycare closures going on. So that is, I just want to again focus on the fact that that is the only reason to use this expanded paid FMLA under this new law. But if you move over to the third column, which is the emergency paid sick leave, so those initial 2 weeks of paid sick leave, there people are eligible for leave for certainly an increased number of reasons, whether it's caring for themselves or for another person in their family. And we've tried to divide this up a little for you. The first three reasons are more employees who are taking time off to deal with individual issues, whether it's they're subject to a quarantine or isolation order, they have concerns about themselves having coronavirus, or they're actually experiencing symptoms of it. The remaining reasons, at least reasons 4 and 5, are dealing with either a family member, or again, number 5 is a mirror of the expanded FEMLA, where you're dealing with a child who's home because their school has closed. And reason number 6 here is a little bit of a catch-all for leaving open additional reasons specified by Health and Human Services or DOL or the Treasury. So looking through these, I do think it's important to just again focus on the fact that with these new paid leave laws, while you may be eligible for emergency paid sick leave, those initial 2 weeks, for a variety of reasons in that third column, that does not necessarily mean that you will then be available for the additional 10 weeks of expanded FMLA. Again, that's only for the school closure and daycare closures. So we touch on.
I was going to say, and John,
ahead,
when we talk about expanded FMLA, if an employee has taken some leave already under the FMLA, say the employer works in a calendar year and they've already taken 4 weeks of leave earlier in the year, how would that work with and then they qualify for the expanded FMLA? How much leave under that new act would they be entitled to?
Right. So what the Department of Labor has clarified is that the expanded FMLA does not essentially provide a separate or new set of 12 weeks to be used for that reason. It provides an additional reason to use FEMLA leave, but you still only get a total of 12 weeks. So in Leslie's example, if they had taken, for instance, 4 weeks previously for their own serious health condition or a family member's, they would only have 8 weeks remaining at this point if they'd taken 4 weeks within the previous 12 months. So they would have 8 weeks to use for this now expanded reason or any other reason. On the flip side of that, if an employee uses the expanded FMLA, maybe they need 6 weeks to watch their child while schools are closed and they're unable to work, then later in the year, hopefully once all of this is behind us, they need to take sort of the traditional FEMLA for, let's say, the birth of a child. They would only have the 6 weeks then at that point of FEMLA available to them. So it's an important point, is that you're not getting this separate bucket of leave here. It does count against your regular FEMLA leave that you're entitled to.
Right. The concept is this is a bolt-on. This is an expansion of justifications and certain compensation components, but we're still dealing with the FMLA 12 weeks per year. I mean, the traditional reasons, except for these unique circumstances. Okay. Well, let's talk about how people get paid and the amounts they get paid, John, because that's obviously that is all brand new. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. Well, of course, under traditional FMLA, those 12 weeks of leave are unpaid. What these new laws have provided for is paid leave, and they're looked at differently depending on the reason for your leave. Under the expanded FMLA, where you would be taking leave again only for caring for a child whose school is closed, again, the first 10 days of expanded FMLA are unpaid. And after that, you would receive 2/3 of your regular pay. Now, there is a cap on that. It's capped at $200 a day and a total of $10,000 per employee if they were to use it for those the entirety of those 10 weeks of paid leave. Moving over to the emergency paid sick leave, again, this is divided into 2 sections. If you recall, we had the numbered sort of qualifying reasons in the previous slide of reasons 1 through 3 were using leave for yourself, and reasons 4 through 6 were using it to care for a family member. there's a difference in how you get paid depending on what the reason is. If you're using that leave for yourself, either because you've been ordered into isolation or quarantine, or you're experiencing symptoms, or you've fallen ill, then you would get your regular rate. Again, there's a cap here. It's $511 per day for 10 days. If you are caring for a family member, either your child is home from school, or your son or daughter or spouse has fallen ill and you need to care for them, then you're going to get, again, 2/3 of your regular rate, similar to the expanded FMLA. And again, there's a cap of $200 a day in that case. So it's very important to hone in on the reasons that someone is using emergency paid sick leave.
Because these actually dovetail very nicely, and that's not an accident. If the employee is sick, the employee is going to be out at $511 a day cap for 10 days. Then after that, if the individual sickness continues, serious health condition, they're going to continue up to $200 a day if it's a coronavirus-related condition, subject to the $10,000 cap. If it's because of a family member, then the entire leave is subject to the $200 a day, $10,000 cap. So these make sense when they're put together like that, and is designed to provide a little more money to the individual worker who herself is the one that's ill, a little less money when you're responding to the needs of a family member, either because of school or their illness. Okay.
And just one more note before we move on here on they do use the regular rate. I just wanted to add on that, and the Department of Labor guidance makes note of this, is that regular rate will include commissions or tips, and the way of calculating that is calculating the average rate of pay over the last 6 months if the employee had been there that long, or as long as they've been at work, if they've been there for 6 months. So that's how you would go about calculating that. It's not necessarily just their rate of pay at the time they request leave. So just wanted to make that point.
Okay, let's keep going.
This slide deals with something that's been a lot of questions. It seems that has been coming up a lot, how employees might be eligible to use with other leave, or how employers may be able to require using these new leave options with other employer-provided leave. Under traditional FMLA, it's either the employee can elect or the employer can require the use of any additional provided leave, PTO, or paid sick leave, anything that may be available. That's not the case with either the expanded FMLA or the paid sick leave. In neither case can the employer require that other leave is used. The employee can elect it if it's available to use, but it can't be without the employee's agreement. They cannot force them to use other available leave while they are using these paid leave options.
So that's going to be, those are important practical kind of implementation questions. All right.
Mm-hmm. And if we can roll to the next slide here. And this is dealing with job protection when you are out on leave. Typically under FMLA, employers generally have an obligation to provide the same or equivalent position upon the employee's return to work, although there may be a few exceptions to that. Here, with the expanded FMLA, the law specifically notes that while most covered employees would be subject to the typical FMLA job protection provisions, smaller employees, in this case dealing with employees less than 25, employers with less than 25 employees, there's a few exceptions for them that employees may not be eligible to return to at least the same position. These are included in the chart here. But just to go through them quickly, it's if the position no longer exists due to essentially ill effects on the business related to coronavirus, the employer still has to make those reasonable efforts to restore the employee to an equivalent position if possible. And if they cannot, there's a continuing 1-year obligation thereafter to contact the employee if an equivalent position does become available. So it's not just at the time they try to return, but there's a continuing obligation there. One point of note with regard to the emergency paid sick leave, although the statute itself doesn't include any job restoration language, the DOL guidance has noted that due to congressional direction, they want these statutes to follow to be dealt with consistently where possible. So it will actually, according to their guidance, it will follow the same job protection rules as the expanded FMLA. So in other words, if you're more than 25 employees, then you would be the typical job protection FMLA standards. If you're less than 25 employees, then you would be, there's some exceptions to the restoration of work if you can satisfy the standards in the second column that we went through. And there would be the equal 1-year tail obligation as well.
Well, let's look at a couple of hypotheticals in the remaining minutes here and see if we can put these together. So the first hypothetical, John, I'll let you answer this. Let's assume that schools are closed due to COVID-19. Unfortunately, this is not a hypothetical. As a result, an employee hired in January actually now must stay home to watch their child. The employees are unable to work or to telework during this time. So the question, this is the basic one, what leave are those employees entitled to?
Right,
John?
and looking at this, as the answer comes up here, they would in fact be entitled to the 12 weeks of paid leave at 2/3 pay. So again, there's those caps involved there. But the first 2 weeks are covered by the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. So it fills that initial gap during the expanded FEMLA. And then the remaining 10 weeks would be covered by the expanded FMLA, because this does fall under that sole reason for expanded FMLA of where the schools are closed and you need to stay home to watch your child. So in this case, you'll get the full 12 weeks of paid leave at the 2/3 of the regular rate.
So this integrates also the dovetailing of the two new paid programs in that sense. All right. Let's look at a second hypothetical. The second hypothetical, an employee unfortunately is experiencing COVID-19 symptoms. The doctor advises a 2-week self-quarantine. Following the quarantine, then the child starts experiencing symptoms and tests positive, unfortunately, for the coronavirus. The child requires continuing medical attention for several weeks, and the employee cannot work during that time. Question, what is the employee entitled to under these unfortunate but increasingly common circumstance? You want to work us through the answer?
Sure. So in this case, the employee would only be entitled to 2 weeks of paid leave. They would get those initial 2 weeks of paid leave at their regular rate because they would be caring for themselves during that time, or they'd be subject to a quarantine from a health provider. They're subject to a self-quarantine. So they would get the 2 weeks of paid leave under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. But here's the difference, is that thereafter they're only entitled to unpaid leave under traditional FMLA. That would be qualified as a family member with a serious health condition. Even though they're at home caring for their child, it's not due to school closure. It's due to the child's illness. So they would not be eligible for the paid leave under the expanded FMLA. So again, we wanted to just bring that back around, that the expanded FMLA only has that narrow purpose of covering the school closures and daycare closures. So if you're caring for your child for another reason, such as illness, even if it's related to coronavirus, you would not get that paid leave for the final 10 weeks of FMLA.
Right. Of course, under traditional FMLA, they may qualify to use their PTO or other plans. All right. Absolutely. We got a few slides left, and we're close on time. So let's look quickly at reimbursement of paid leave.
Sure. I'll just quickly go through this as we're tying this up here. But of course, these paid leave provisions are provided with the caveat that all this pay will be reimbursed, and the way it's going to be reimbursed is through payroll tax credits. The CARES Act Phase 3 made clear that businesses can retain, instead of waiting to take these tax credits, essentially take advances on them by retaining the payroll taxes that they would otherwise be paying. So instead of paying those to the IRS, you can retain any that would match the paid leave you've provided under these laws. In the event you've paid out more paid leave in excess of what you can retain in terms of payroll tax, then the IRS is developing and will be releasing a form that you can file with them. And according to the IRS's guidance, their goal is to provide rapid refunds for this, rapid reimbursement. They state a 2-week expedited procedure, although we'll see how this plays out in the coming weeks and months. But they are making this a priority.
Okay. So let's just close with a couple of the what we call thorny issues, some of the issues that we're going to be continuing to look at pretty closely. The treatment of contract workers. Notice and recall earlier we talked about coverage determinations that a variety of workers that you may get through day laborers or other labor suppliers. Those may get covered and treated in terms of your employee count. There's clearly a consensus that there should be broad coverage for a variety of benefits, whether you as the employer or whether the individual, traditional individual independent contractor is eligible for different benefits. Paid benefits now is a trend that is rapidly developing and being sorted through. The part-time employee, John referenced that, the duration of employment. That is one we would strongly encourage you to look at the detail within the DOL's guidance. There's a lot of sub-issues in there. Many employers do have the part-time employees with varying work schedules. I think in the Washington, D.C. area where so many companies have workforces that are integrated and working shoulder to shoulder with the federal sector, we now have two classes of workers in this country. Federal workers under this law are not treated as well. That is because that they are not protected, generally speaking, by Title I, as John mentioned, of FMLA. They're under a separate title, Title II. A bold prediction, I think that Congress will close that gap and likely make further amendments to FMLA to address the federal workforce and put them on a similar platform. The single entity standards, we had some questions about that. We clarified that a little bit, but that is one that is very fact intensive, and I would strongly encourage, if you have those issues, think about them and remember the admonition that we issued in terms of how rapidly how that these determinations will apply to beyond the context of the COVID-19 benefits, but also to other legal obligations. Finally, the keeping up to date. It just can't emphasize enough. The Labor Department it seems like 24 to 48 hours is posting guidance. I give them kudos for that. They are working very hard, but it also means that we need to work very hard and be checking there frequently, and set yourselves for an alert if you can on that.
And look to the end of the questions because they don't tell you it's new. They just add on additional answers.
Yeah. That's something we're asking if they could please annotate the date or even the time that they post them or update them, because that makes it a little tricky because we're up to 59 now Q&A. Let's just close briefly on future developments. We mentioned that DOL regulations are coming. We're going to do that. Leslie had touched on Phase 4, another legislative bill. I think that's highly likely myself. I think Leslie does too. I think there's the growing political realities are I think that's going to be coming. I don't know if it'll be quite as rapid fire, but probably because I think Congress has gone home, haven't they, Leslie? Yeah, I mean, so.
Yeah, I mean, it's people are leaving and a lot of money has been doled out, but there are holes. So I think it's going to probably not happen as quickly as my prediction. But, we'll have to see. Right. These are unusual times.
There are holes, and there'll be, I think, efforts to further fine-tune what they've already put out there, too, as they see how it works. So, as they say, same time, same channel next week. Come join us next Monday, April 6th. We're going to do another weekly briefing. It's going to be very similar to this. We'll have a different crew of subject matter experts, but we really do welcome the opportunity to share with you as we're trying to stay very hard to stay on top of this. Obviously, questions, comments in between, get in touch. We're doing our best to stay on top, and we'll do our best to help you. So with that, Leslie and John, I want to thank you both. This was great, and I really enjoyed having a chance to be with both of you, albeit virtually today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
All right, everybody.
Be safe. Bye-bye.